Ladies and gentlemen, you didn't read about this attack, Islamic State attack, in the newspapers about Lizardo Evans cut down in cold blood by two attackers armed with nothing but knives in a little church in South India. An attack just of the kind we've seen in Saint-Étienne du Rouvray in France, so many places in Germany, in the United States, a typical Islamic State attack. And the reason you didn't read about it anywhere is that it happened in March 1764 in a small town called Dharmapatnam on the Malabar coast. Much like the United States Special Forces who killed Osama bin Laden so many centuries later, the guards at the Dharmapatnam church wanted to erase the killers from history. A contemporary bureaucrat recorded, a Portuguese bureaucrat, I quote, "The bodies of the above Moors were immediately ordered to be thrown into the sea as an example to deter others from the like attempts in future, and to prevent any religious," illegible word, perhaps merit, "being got from them, so that they may not be worshipped as saints, as is the practice by their caste, of all those who murder a Christian." I'll come back to this story in a little bit, but the reason I find it fascinating is many of the debates we're having in India over terrorism, over Islamist terrorism specifically, talk about it as if it's a problem that suddenly descended on us yesterday or 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And it's nothing of the kind. Islamism is something, Islamist violence is something that has a history and a heritage that is centuries old, that has formed a distinct political tradition of its own, dating back at least to the late 16th century. And in the minds of modern jihadists, at least, this history is something that is alive and important. When we read their literature, when we read their manifestos, it's something that informs their actions. If nothing else, when we seek to understand the sort of sunrise of the Islamic State or of Al-Qaeda in India that we are witnessing today, this historical sensibility is something that we need to bring to bear and to understand. What is it, this sunrise, that we are in fact talking about? The numbers in India, since I first began reporting on this story in 2015, are pretty small, or appear at first glance anyway to be pretty small, and I'll qualify that statement in a bit. We had some 67 Indian nationals. That number will have risen since I wrote this figure to a little bit above 70, standing trial for plots involving the Islamic State, or plots inspired by the Islamic State would be probably more accurate. 62 Indians have gone abroad to fight with the Islamic State, either to Syria or to Afghanistan. 21 of these with their families, with entire families. There's been one particularly bizarre case which you may have read about, involving people who joined a cult in Kerala and left en masse, as it were, along with two infants. They've had children over there and are thought to be living in Nangarhar, with a sort of Islamic State proto-community of people over there, providing services ranging from engineering to medical expertise to fighters over there. Most of these people, from what we know, are fairly highly educated. 68% of these Islamic State linked individuals are graduates or postgraduates. Only 11% had any form of religious education at all. Most of them, almost all of them in fact, are what you would describe as middle class. Typically the children of quite secularized families for whom religion has been a matter of personal practice. Overwhelmingly, the story you hear is of children who who break with their families for one reason or the other, finding their parents' versions of religion inadequately orthodox. And this recurrent motif of bitter family feuds is there. We've had some sort of flow into Al-Qaeda as well. As you know, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent has been set up as a dedicated branch of Al-Qaeda. Sana-ul Haq, the head of Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, turned out to be an Indian national. who left India after the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992. Studied at a madrasa in Karachi for many, many years, and acquired some degree of popularity as a writer of apocalyptic religious works, where he predicts the coming of the Day of Judgment, and has a large volume of quite entertaining books, actually, I have to admit, on topics like the relationship between UFOs and the devil, and various signs of the coming of the apocalypse, which the signs that will foresee it, but talks about these about the need for individual Muslims to participate in jihad, and therefore to be redeemed prior to the coming of this apocalypse. All of this work fits in quite neatly into what you might describe as a popular jihadi Ghazi warrior tradition that's quite well documented, dating back to the 16th century and earlier. The historian Stephen Dale has documented this work on the Malabar coast. And it's important to remember, I think, here to note, because we often end up having these conversations about, Islam and Salafism, and talk about these things as if they're sundered from the rest of history in some way. On the Malabar coast, for example, the jihadi tradition squarely comes out of the clash between the Portuguese and the Portuguese efforts to break the monopoly of the Muslims of the Malabar coast into trading spices with West Asia, with the Persian Gulf. Many bitter battles there, and in popular history as well as in sort of classical historical chronicles, you will find reference to battles between self-described jihadis and Portuguese troops on merchant ships. And in fact, what you might describe as early suicide attacks, where lightly armed attackers with cutlasses jump on Portuguese men of war and are cut down in acts which to this day are venerated in folk tradition among certain communities in Kerala. For example, there is a story of, or an epic poem of an attacker who goes to rescue a girl from one of these ships, and his limbs are cut off, and wherever the limbs float to shore, various miracles are recorded and said to have taken place. In North India, Aisha Jalal has documented this work, has documented much the same tradition with figures like Shah Waliullah. You have jihad against Maharaja Ranjit Singh's empire in northern India, and in fact this continues to fire the imagination of modern jihadists. The beginning of Maulana Masood Azhar's disquisitions on the Quran refer to the Battle of Balakot, which took place in Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time, and where the contemporary jihadist movement was crushed. And he talks about going to Balakot to meditate upon this historic jihad, and choosing that place to write his to meditate and write upon his disquisitions on jihad and the Quran. Returning to India, we find many of this sort of historic experience firing the mind of jihadists in what you might describe as this modern jihadist tradition, which really, or the current phase really starts up in 1992 or the mid-1980s, when the sort of great wave of Hindu-Muslim contestation, which is still very far from sped, begins to gather momentum in India. Many of the figures in this sort of first phase are products in one way or the other of the ugliness of the mid-1980s, which witnesses some of the greatest Hindu-Muslim riots the country has seen. Abdul Karim Tunda, who's now being tried in a Delhi court, for example, goes on to join the Lashkar-e-Taiba, talks in his testimony to police about his radicalization, which he attributes to seeing one of his in-laws, Zafar Rahman, burned alive in the 1985 riots in the town of Bhiwandi near Mumbai. One of his co-architects, Jali Sansari, similarly talks about his radicalization because of riots in Maharashtra. Azam Gauri, the third conspirator, was actually a Maoist of some order and a left radical who becomes radicalized and discovers Islam as a consequence of riots in Hyderabad, And this early cell is what you might call one of the first jihadist cells in India. In 1992, after a number of early efforts to set up Muslim vigilante groups in Mumbai and to make various kinds of low-grade explosive on their own, Abdul Karim Tunda eventually travels to Bangladesh, reaches out to jihadists there and ties up with the Lashkar-e-Taiba through Pakistan's intelligence services, and then begins taking some small numbers of people to train and so on. If you read again their work, there's a self-consciousness about the role of jihad. Most of these individuals are from what you might describe as the Salafi tradition. But it's important to remember that not every religious Salafist goes away and becomes a terrorist. And you need to look quite closely at the motivations of individuals who do get involved in violence and not paint with excessively broad brushstrokes. If I think one wants to have a clear picture of just what is going on. There's a next sort of phase, if you like, of radicalization, which starts with what you might call the Indian Mujahidin phenomenon in 2002. Many of you will have heard of the Students' Islamic Movement of India, but for those who haven't, it is the student wing of the Jamaat-e-Islami, which emerges after the emergency in an effort to capitalize on the new political opportunities. It's shut down eventually for being excessively radical. But Simi becomes extremely politically radical, picks up an Islamist language, talks about retaliation against Hindu fundamentalist violence, but doesn't actually as an organization commit itself. But under that umbrella, there are a great many sort of would-be jihadists who break away from the organization, saying it's all talk, and organize themselves into a jihadist group. And from 2001, you have a couple of individuals, three or four individuals, who using their own connections with organized crime networks go away to train in Pakistan. And by 2004 have gathered enough like-minded people to have their first convention, as it were, on a wonderfully named place called Jolly Beach in Karnataka. It's actually a very, very beautiful place. I recommend a visit. Bhatkal in Karnataka, very lovely place. And by 2005 are carrying on what then becomes India's most protracted and bloody urban bombing campaign. The 2006 bombings in Mumbai on the suburban train system, which claim over 150 lives, was their work. And many of the people we now see, eventually in 2008 this group is wrapped up. Many of the people who survive arrest here flee to Pakistan. But after the Mumbai attacks, by their accounts, the ISI comes down on them very, very hard, stops them from doing anything very substantial, and some of the more radical members of the group move to Afghanistan, looking at Al-Qaeda as an option, and when the Islamic State opens up, move there. Several of those wanted by India's police services recently figured in an Islamic State video that was released this winter gone by, talking about their experience and their eventual journey to Raqqa. But we also know that some individuals are still in Afghanistan and quite possibly linked to these Kerala families that are in Nangarhar. Just to conclude then, I mean, we see these recurrent phases, these recurrent waves of radicalization with distinct groups of individuals driven by a combination of religious belief, ideological belief, and by political circumstance, joining successive, if you like, trends in the global sort of jihadist landscape and using it as an enabler for their own political agenda or Islamist agenda at home. What kinds of interventions might one have? Well, there are a couple of obvious ones, and the obvious ones are obviously in the domain of Indian counterterrorism capacity. One doesn't have to be a genius to know that India has done not very much since 26/11 to significantly enhance its capacity despite large amounts of big talk. I'm not quoting any qualified data, just parliamentary data when I say that the Intelligence Bureau, for example, remains almost a third under its sanction strength of personnel, despite this is what, almost 10 years after the Mumbai attacks. Most police forces remain undertrained and under strength. And training curricula and so on have not in many state police forces been revamped in any significant way since the British left. These are obvious kinds of solutions, though. There is a larger sort of problem also, which is that the political system has lost its ability, really, to reach out to the young people who form the core of these jihadist groups. I mentioned earlier that the numbers in India are not very big, but that number should be treated with caution. And the caution is this: out of these 70 odd individuals who have been arrested for Islamic State plots, the fascinating pattern is this: typically a young person gets recruited online and then reaches out to friends immediately close by and succeeds in recruiting 2 or 3 people to join his group. There is not a single case where an individual who sought to create a group was not in short order able to create a group within a matter of weeks. This to me is a matter of real concern, because it suggests that there is a higher degree of support among certainly a part of the Muslim youth cohort than we would like to imagine. And if you look carefully among discussions on certainly certain kinds of Facebook pages, certain kinds of chat fora, you will see a level of resentment, of anger, of alienation that should give pause. This is a cohort that is the first sort of educated middle class cohort to emerge, and is probably facing problems of discrimination with things like housing, with employment, with assimilation that are quite deep. And the kinds of mechanisms for political assimilation that would have been there 20 years ago or 30 years ago probably do not exist today. And there is no institutional apparatus to bring them about. Final question I think should probably be candidly addressed is, should we care? Terrorism last year in all its forms, across India claimed 250 lives. Traffic accidents claimed 150,000 lives. In a country India's size, maybe we shouldn't be bothered. We should just absorb these things, and we're not doing a bad job of it. In my view, that would be quite short-sighted, because Islamist violence preys on one of the most fundamental fault lines in our country that dates back to partition and beyond. And allowing violence founded on religious lines to continue to flourish risks setting off cataclysms that will have consequences that are far, far larger in consequence than the violence itself. This is something I think that calls for much more granular level of understanding than we have today. To give just one example, a vast amount of Al-Qaeda literature and chat groups coming on chat groups and Facebook pages today is in Malayalam and Tamil, and completely understudied. I'm yet to see a single monograph or study of any of this new work. I don't know those languages, so I have nothing. There's a lot of jihadist production in Bengali. Again, I'm yet to see a single production. So we need a much more granular level of knowledge on what is happening in these groups. It's a challenge for the scholarly community. It also needs some genuine thinking on policy and policy initiative to address these things in new and creative ways. Thank you.